All right, so yeah, we are picking up, like I said, on day 9 here, where we are going through the fourth part of that chapter 5 of your NASM, or is it chapter 6? But we're going through the assessments chapter, and we are going to go through our upper body postural assessments today. So a lot less notes. It's really nice, but we're going to break down like how to do these assessments because they have a lot of implications related to upper body dysfunction, you know, shoulders elevating, shoulder impingement syndrome, clicking, things like that. So I got a couple of videos to show you guys that are going to talk about like how to sort of assess these things and how to look for them. I think it goes going to be an example. I think the pushing one's first. So yeah, let me share the sound here. And this is this guy here, by the way. This is Rick at NASM. He's awesome. He's like the NASM's kind of go-to guru guy. And his stuff is really, really great. He does a really good breakdown. So
this is going to be an example of a pushing assessment. So when we go through the pushing assessment, we want to pay attention to these 5 main kinetic chain checkpoints. So the feet, knees, lumbopelvic hip, shoulder complex, and then the head. So as he goes through this, I want to get him in a good position. So first of all, let me have you take your back foot. And this is the cue that I'm going to give. His back foot is currently out like this a little bit. If you could take your back foot and just straighten it completely. So that's a good visual cue just to give, as long as he knows that your hand is representing his foot in that particular example. Now go ahead and just press your hands out. I'm going to use my hands as something for him to go to, and then go back. So as he does this, I want good alignment from the head, shoulders, hips, knees, and feet. I'm gonna have him straighten out that back leg. And when he does this, it depends on how much weight is being pulled back this way. If it's really heavy, then he might need to lean forward a little bit just so he keeps from falling backwards. If that's the case, you have to be careful. If they go into a really wide stance, there's still a tendency to keep an upright torso, and that's going to put an arch in the lower back. So that's one of the things we need to pay attention to in any of the assessments. And again, it's just an exercise, but every exercise is an assessment. We want to pay attention to all of this. So as he's doing this, his heel is down on the ground, his knee is locked out, so he's working his quad here, squeezing that glute, and making sure there's no arch in the back, or a neutral arch in the lumbar spine. So go ahead and press forward. Hold that position. Common things that are going to happen when people go through this, and we'll start at the top, is there's a tendency when people do a pushing exercise for their heads to jut forward. So go ahead and just press out and jut your head forward towards me. So they'll jut forward this way. Now, one of the ways that we can kind of cue out of this is just show them what they're doing. And I could say, hey, Jerry, right now your head's jutting forward. Just bring your chin back into that position. Perfect. So it's just a good visual cue for them to see. And then what we may also see, go ahead and bring the arms out, and as they push, you might see people's shoulders elevate. So go ahead and press forward and let your shoulders come up as you press out. Good. So again, another visual cue that I could give to him is I could say, hey, you're pulling up like this. Do you see my shoulders? Go ahead and just drop those shoulders down and take it back. Good. So again, visual cues so that they see what they're doing. They can't see themselves. So we have to be that representation for them. Again, now he's going to press out. As he presses out, there tends to be an arch in the back. So go ahead and press out and let your back arch as you're trying to push forward. And there, this happens quite a bit actually. And you can see the increased arch in the lumbar spine. So I might give that cue, but I wouldn't necessarily give this cue to him from the front. I might turn to the side where he can see me, and I can see your back is arching like that. Can you draw in a little bit, squeeze the glute, and minimize the arch in your back? So again, he's got a vantage point where you can see it. Now, also for me as a practitioner, I don't want to look only from the front because I wouldn't have seen that. So I need to be mobile too and walk around my clients to make sure that they're staying in proper alignment. We stay with those 5 kinetic chain checkpoints: head, shoulders, hips, or lumbopelvic hip complex, knees, and feet. And of course, there's the foot that oftentimes turns out when people do these exercises. And what we would do is we simply go ahead and press out. He's got his feet turned out. I could give that cue that he gave, that I gave to him before, Or I might even give a tactile cue. So if I came around here and I went towards his foot, see how his foot is turning out a little bit? I might want his heel to move out so it keeps his foot in line. So I would say, do you feel my foot, my toe, right here on the side of your foot? Can you follow my toe? Perfect. And so it's just a small change, but these are tactile cues that can be really helpful with our clients when they go through these exercises. And I want to minimize tactile cueing because I don't want to work with him and say, keep your face here and turn your head this. And it's not a comfortable position to be in if you're the client. But if I can give those cues and I can talk through it and I can show him what he's doing and I can continue to provide really unintrusive tactile cues, then the client is going to appreciate that more and they're going to have really good form as they continue to work out. And so every exercise is an assessment. We want to look at every exercise and assess. As a matter of fact, you don't have to do a separate or very specific assessment for pushing. We can start getting them into their exercises and begin assessing from there. And as we do this, we want to optimize their movement. So every time they do an exercise, they do it in really good form and they're maintaining their alignment each time they exercise. So again, every exercise is an assessment and we assess every exercise.
So I love that, by the way. Like, I love that we assess every movement and every movement is an assessment, you know, because like you are going to continue to spot stuff
Here we go.
Client when you are doing like, you know, your training routines. Like when you're working with your clients, you're going to notice that like, oh, you're falling out of alignment a little bit, you know. This is why that's happening. This muscle squeezing when it shouldn't be. This muscle's not doing what it's supposed to be doing, right? And we're going to fix that by, you know, X, Y, and Z. We're going to lay that out for our clients. You know, if somebody's arching their back, right, a really great cue is just tell them to squeeze their glutes and tighten their core. Those two things will sort of naturally rotate that pelvis back to a neutral position. Do you guys remember we may have done this in class where we were doing like a kneeling hip flexor stretch? And, you know, a lot of times when people are doing that, they'll often get this like kind of exaggerated arch. Like, you know, they'll go into this kneel and then they'll take their arm up and then what they'll do is they'll arch forward because they think like, you know, they're trying to get their, you know, they're trying to go forward like this, but then they'll kind of throw their upper back into an arch like that because it looks like it's more of a stretch, you know, like a lot of people, you know, we sort of associate doing a lot of movement with sort of what we're looking for, you know, and it's like, again, like exercise, yes, is about movement, you know, like exercise so much is, you know, learning how to move through proper ranges of motion. It's a very dynamic thing that our body is able to do. But it is also sometimes, I would argue that exercise and working out is just as much about not moving or resisting moving as it is about moving. So, you know, that's something that we kind of want to pay attention to. So when you were doing that kneeling hip flexor stretch, a lot of times like, hey, squeeze your glute. And when people do is that will often drive their pelvis back to a neutral position rather than anteriorly tilting when we're trying to do a stretch to fix an anterior tilt, you know, like we're not working against ourselves in that version. So that is sort of like, I love that point that he makes. But looking at the pushing assessment, you guys are going to have to be able to sort of answer questions about this on an exam. And so we got to have its definition very clear at the top. So, you know, what the pushing assessment is, it's an upper body postural assessment that is assessing dynamic flexibility. So again, we're saying dynamic flexibility, just like we did during the overhead squat. Dynamic just means movement. And then flexibility is moving through a full range of motion. So you are moving through a full range of motion. Core strength, because yes, like, you know, your core is gonna have to be engaged. This is putting stress on the core by like top loading something that wants to pull backwards. That will feel, you'll feel that in your core. And so if this is unable to stabilize, we see that arching that we talked about. And upper body control, just, you know, neuromuscular efficiency, recruiting the right muscles in the chest rather than recruiting those shoulder muscles or the neck muscles, stuff that's really not meant to help during a push, but like sometimes, again, because of overactive and underactive muscles, our body likes to recruit the wrong stuff, you know. And so that's basically what we are assessing for, right? Upper body posture, dynamic flexibility, core strength, upper body control. So what you're going to do is you're going to instruct your client to, draw their abdomen in, keep their feet shoulder width apart, or you can do a staggered stance. Like you can still do a staggered stance at shoulder width apart, right? They can be shoulder width apart and then they can just spread them like this. That will be a lot more comfortable for most of your clients. Not a lot of people have like the balance necessary to do it with like feet straight at the sides. And then you are going to make sure their toes are pointed straight forward. A lot of people love to turn out that back heel, which does give them a little bit of surface area. If they need to do that, like if you need to have like the feet spread and then like that back foot has to turn just a little bit, that's okay. But you don't want to turn it so much that their hips start to rotate. Which is what you'll see a lot of people kind of naturally go towards that, and they'll end up in a position almost like this sometimes. It looks like, honestly, it looks like they're fencing. If you've ever seen like sword fighters, that's like that's their position where they have like one leg forward and one leg back. And one straight and one sideways. But so that is sort of our body position. You can see she's got a really great alignment right here. You'll notice in the video he did it with his shoes off. You could do that. You don't necessarily have to. We're not looking at dorsiflexion or plantar flexion. We're not looking at the foot and ankle complex. So like he has his shoes off in the video. I think that is because like when they were shooting these videos, I think they were just flowing from like the overhead squat into the next. And sometimes like I've done that with my clients where I'm like, all right, and before I even let them put their shoes back on, I just go straight into my other posture assessments. But you don't have to do that. That's like always get the shoes off during the overhead squat, but like during the pushing and the pulling, you guys are going to be fine without having to do that. So you're going to instruct your client to press the handles forward as in a chest press motion and then return slowly. Now you should pick a weight that your client can do for around 20 repetitions. If they can do more than 20, you might not be pressing hard enough. They may not be pressing hard enough to actually like recruit the wrong muscles if those muscles are going to recruit. So we might not activate the stuff that we don't need. We do want to pick a relatively heavy weight, but if you're also like going super, 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 super heavy and your client really can't like control that very well, that's also not super ideal. So I usually try to aim for about 15 to 20 repetitions when I'm doing my pushing and my pulling assessments. And I love to actually do it for 2 sets. With a little bit of rest in between to see if like it shows up in set number 2, but also again, to kind of feel like a workout in a way, so again, like now, if we start to imagine like, I'm just going to kind of pull up a little like notepad thing here. Imagine like what a 1 hour, fitness assessment session sort of looks like for a trainer, right? Like if I brought my clients into the gym and it's like, all right, we're going to go through this next hour. I started them with the Park Q. I moved into, I would probably, let's do it Microsoft Word because then I can zoom in. You guys can see. There we go. So if we start to like think about like maybe what it actually kind of looks like to flow an entire fitness assessment, it might start with like introductions, waivers, etc. And then we would go into like the Park Q and the general / medical history questionnaire, right? So now it's like, okay, we're getting all that laid out, and it's like we get to know our client. Now they're already sitting for all this, right? Like this is happening like on the gym floor, and then we can immediately move into our physiologic assessment. So we get like resting heart rate, blood pressure, which is optional. We'll get we'll calculate target heart rates show them like what their cardio zones are, and then be like, look, these are the zones that we're going to kind of work into by just like calculating that out in front of them. Again, use a calculator. You don't really have to do too much of it. But we want to get their resting heart rate while they've done all of this, right? They're sitting there answering questions like, we're working our way through the general and the medical history question. We're trying to figure out like what's important to them and what their overall goals are and stuff, In fact, I'm going to add that here, even though it's not officially like a thing, but like, hugely important. So we get now they're sitting for a while, so we can get their resting heart rate, we can get their blood pressure right away, and then we can calculate out their target heart rate zones right there in the beginning, and come back to which ones they qualify for later. And already we're starting the process of being like, Edwin, this program is for you. You know what I mean? Like, and they're like, oh, okay, great. Like, and they start to feel, a little bit more confident that this is actually like, they're purchasing this thing built for them, rather than, a trainer who just threw darts at a dartboard and picked out a routine and was like, all right, you're gonna do all these in a row, So then after that, we can go into like our body composition assessments, get into the, throw them on the scale, get their BMI, do some circumference stuff, find out their body fat percentage, all of that. And now we start the actual like physical stuff. And so I like, we could go straight into the overhead squat, but me personally, I kind of like to start with the 3-minute step test or the Rockport walk test, because those are a really good way to kind of get their blood nice and warm, get the heart pumping and things like that. So if we look at like the YMCA step test, which is my favorite to do in a traditional gym setting, but if I've got like a senior client or like a majorly obese client, then I won't do the YMCA step test, just because it tends to be kind of high impact. So instead we'll do the Rockport walk test. So now we know it's like, hey, those heart rate zones that we calculated out earlier, now I know what you sort of qualify for, what zones are going to be best for you, based on like how well you perform during that assessment. Then we can move into the overhead squat. So we do the overhead squat. And like I said, the way I like to do this, I like to do 3 sets, and I like to do 15 repetitions, 3 sets, and that means 3 views. Anterior, lateral, and posterior, right? So I kind of like to kind of do all 3 of those views there while I'm doing the overhead squat. And like, do I really need to do that many? Probably not. But again, I want this to kind of feel a little bit like a workout for my client. I want them to do to kind of feel as if they're getting a little bit of like, effort in. And so when we do that, it's like, okay, now they've already done this like a little bit of cardio, and now they're like doing some squats and stuff. And so they're really pumping. They might be sweating a little bit. That's great. And I can break that, and then I can start breaking that down and be like, here's what I saw during the assessment. Here's what muscles are overactive. Here's what muscles are underactive, et cetera, et cetera. And then I can work into my pushing/pulling assessments. And again, I kind of like to do like 2 to 3 sets of this. And I like to do between 15 and 20 repetitions. Again, like, you don't actually have to do that, but I kind of want it to feel a little bit tough. And that way, like, it's a bit challenging. So this is sort of where we're at in the process here. You can see we've done like a little bit of squatting, we've done a little bit of pushing, we've done a little bit of pulling. We're getting like a total body workout in. And then, in a little bit, what we're going to talk about later, as we finish up this class this week, we are also going to see like the Sharks skill test and the Davies test, which are performance assessments built around like, upper body and lower body agility. And we can do our 1 rep max assessments, for the squat, bench press. Those are the ones that are in your textbook. But we could also do like the deadlift, depending on if that's like, if that one's important to them. I'd say honestly, those are like the big three. I don't really ever do like 1 rep max assessments on, I'll sometimes do military press, but I don't ever do like bent over rows or anything like that. So that is sort of where we're going to go, from this. This should feel, like I said, like a workout, and you should be able to get through this in about an hour's worth of time. So we're currently right here in sort of the whole process. But hopefully by now you guys are starting to, actually like kind of picture this in your head. This is what we're going to do, by the way, when we get together. I want to take us all the way through basically this entire process. The 1 rep max assessment portion notwithstanding. That's the one part that we're not going to do, just because that is very technical and it takes a lot of time. Takes a really substantial amount of time to do that. So we'll kind of go through the whole process, sort of start to finish, and then that way you guys can see that, and then show you how to do those cardio assessments, and then the next time we meet, we'll sort of like finish up all this. Step 10 here at the very end, once the workout portion is over, it's like, all right, let's head back to the desk and we've got our sales pitch. This is where it's like, all right, so here's what I know, here's how you've moved, here's, the adjustments we've made and stuff. Now it's time for us to sort of like talk about like, do you want to like train together? Do you want to like move forward with this? And kind of take a look there. And that's really what we're kind of, that's the whole process that we're really kind of going for here, with the fitness assessment. I was telling my buddy yesterday, he's thinking about becoming a trainer, and I was like, this is your sales pitch, and it does all the work for you, because I was just showing him, he's like, what does it mean to kind of like, be like a trainer? Because he works out a lot. He's in great shape, but he's like, what's the distinction between like being somebody who's in really good shape and being like an actual personal trainer? And I was like, well, like somebody who's in really good shape who starts coaching is somebody who's like, they're doing what worked for them with someone else, and it could work and it could get mediocre results, but like the distinction between that and like a really good trainer is like the fact that like, we are breaking things down specifically catered to each individual, and then our knowledge base is a little bit wider in general. But like, I think the main, if you asked me what the main distinction is, why it's important to get a personal training certification, I would say like it makes you specific, and we all know that like specific is always going to be better than general. How's everybody feeling so far? Questions? That was a long tear. Checking in with you guys. How you feeling?
Feeling good.
It's really cool stuff.
Love that.
I like the whole assessment part. Yeah, it's nice.
Awesome. So yeah, so that's kind of the process, start to finish. That's what I want to practice, by the way. We're gonna do it as sort of a group, where I'm sort of taking everybody through like a very quick sort of version of all these assessments. And then you guys will get to kind of practice that on each other later in a couple weeks. So that'll be cool.
For the, I think you mentioned this maybe like in another class, but for the 1 rep max stuff, like if they have like, like a certain amount of pain in certain body parts, you could have them do like 10 or 20 reps and calculate it from there too, right?
Yes, you can always do. Yeah, it gets less accurate the higher the reps are, but right, it's still like a good place to kind of work from,
Cool.
And for instance, me, right? Like as I've switched, I was doing like a really heavy routine last month, and now I'm doing like a little bit of a medium routine where it's like relatively heavy, but like not super heavy. A little bit more like training volume and things like that. So I was like calculating it out, and I was like, okay, this was my 3 rep max. And then like I ran it through a calculator, and I was like, okay, I'm trying to do 8 reps this week instead of 3, same movement. And I should be able to, if my 3 rep max was, let's say 100 pounds, right? My 8 rep max should be 75 pounds. I don't know, whatever the number actually was. And so I went to do it, and I was like really struggling like around like 6 or 7 reps. And I was like, yeah. And it's just a very different, situation. Like sometimes your nervous system is like really adapted to sort of the low rep stuff. And it doesn't always translate. So it gets a little bit less accurate the further you get away from the number 1. But it's still, yeah, you can absolutely do assessments that way. And I definitely have in the past where I'm like worried about someone, with like really bad posture. And that's also why we do the posture assessments first, so it's like, oh man, that's a really super intense low back arch. We're going to be pretty cautious about how we do this barbell squat 1 rep max test, or deadlift assessment or something that involves like the lumbopelvic hip complex. So yeah, you can definitely always modify. Okay, so here are the, like you mentioned in the video, right? Here are the sort of like things that we are going to see in terms of compensations. Now, these are actually going to be the same compensations for the upper body and I'm sorry, for the pushing and the pulling assessment. So there's actually no distinction here. Whenever there's pushing or pulling, you are going to look to see, is the low back arching, are the shoulders elevating, and is the head coming forward? So it's exactly the same thing. So they're moving into 2-0-2 tempo for the press, straightforward. And then the pulling assessment, you can see here, if I move into that, right, is a very similar setup, right? It's an upper body postural assessment. It assesses dynamic flexibility. It assesses core strength, neuromuscular control, right? And we are saying, can you recruit those upper back shoulder blade muscles without compensating? Instruct your client to draw their abdomen in, feet shoulder width apart. They can be split stance. I actually find that work. I find that like it's a lot easier with feet together because you can kind of sit into a little bit of a squat, and that sometimes helps. And then instruct them to pull the handles towards themselves. Now they're going to do this in one of 2 ways. That this is not like listed specifically in your textbook. You can see here she is doing a very neutral pull, right? So she's doing sort of a neutral grip. She's got her arms in a neutral position and she's pulling back. That is, if we pull like this, right, I'm doing shoulder extension. And I'm still retracting my shoulder blades. It's not bad. If we want to do our assessment that way, great, go for it. But you can also do horizontal abduction instead. So you can do a pronated grip and go this way and this way. And that's one of the things I like to do between sets. While I'm trying to do things, I like to sort of do both versions of those things. A lot of times in like the pronated version, for instance, you will often see a lot of shoulder elevation if somebody has really tight trap muscles. So that's just another way to kind of make your assessment a little bit harder by having an additional set in there and an additional movement. And your clients will get, again, like this assessment process will feel a little bit like a workout, which is, again, what we're going for, right? This is, going to end in a sales pitch. So that is what we're going to do. So we're going to have them pull at a 2-0-2 tempo, just like we did. And we are looking for the same compensations, right? We want them to be able to do anywhere from 15 to 20 reps. And we're looking to see, does the low back arch, do the shoulders elevate, or does the head come forward? So I'll take a look at the muscles here in just a second and we'll get into that. But again, I wanted to kind of finish up Rich's other video. And so I'm going to pull this up here and walk us through like this process. It's very, very, very similar.
Here we're going to be doing a pulling exercise. But we're going to use the exercise as a means of assessment. So you don't have to do a specific pulling assessment. We can go ahead and start getting our clients moving and assess from there. So Jerry, I'm going to have you go ahead and begin your rowing exercise. And I might just give some general cues at first and watch him row and see what goes on when he does a row. Now, as he does this, I want to start looking at several things. Let's go through those 5 kinetic chain checkpoints again. I'm going to look at the feet, knees, the lumbopelvic hip complex, the shoulders, and that's the entire shoulder girdle, and then I'll look at the way that the head is positioned on top of that. So let me have you take your feet, and he's a little abducted in both of his feet, so turn your feet completely straight ahead, and we're gonna go neutral spine, and let's get a little more pull on this, reach forward, and then pull back. When he pulls back, oftentimes here's what's going to happen is that people will pull, and rather than squeezing their shoulder blades, they'll start to spin in this socket. So take that hand and just pull it back as far as you can. So just move it back, keep going, keep going, keep going. And you can see he's trying to squeeze back, but what's ending up happening is that his scapula is tilting forward. So relax. And do you see how his head starts to jut down? Sometimes clients will pull back really far because they think that that's what you want them to do. They're not sure what you want yet. So go ahead and pull the arm back and squeeze the shoulder blades together, and that's it. So he's got a really good squeeze in between his shoulder blades. So he's got this rhythm between how his humerus starts to pull back and how his shoulder blades squeeze together. If he continues to pull back, it's just gonna start to raise the shoulder blade and tip the shoulder blade forward, and we want to avoid that. So too far is indeed too far. Another thing that also happens is when they do this exercise, they'll jut their head forward. So go ahead and pull back, and as you pull back, they'll either drop the head down, which is a tendency, or shift your head forward like that. So people will shift forward, and it looks like he's trying to win a race right now. So we want to stay away from that as well, because there's also some dyskinesis going on in the thoracic spine often when we see the head protruding forward or that forward head posture. So in a cue like this, I'd say go ahead and reach your arms back forward. I don't want to necessarily have him do a lot of adjustment in this position because the muscles are really tight. So I may let him come back out and then cue, maintaining a neutral position right there. So go ahead and pull back, but don't let your head come forward. And a cue that I oftentimes give is I'd say, pretend that my hand smells really bad, and I put my hand here and they tuck their head back, and that's a good cue to get them to realign. So let's go again. One more thing that you're gonna commonly see when people do an exercise, and this is always an assessment, is they row back and you see an arch in their lower back. So a means of trying to get their arms to come back farther when they pull back, or it could also indicate tightness. Yeah, so now he's got this kind of extension here at his thoracolumbar junction. He's elevating his chest really high. You see some rib flare taking place right there, and you get an anterior pelvic tilt starting to happen. So what I can do is I can give the cue where I'm showing him, this is what you're doing, and this is what I want to see. And that might be something that truly helps him. Or go ahead and reach your arms back forward. And I could say, keep the belly button drawn in, the abdominals tight. So bracing, abdominal bracing, and then squeeze your glutes too. So that's gonna allow, it's really hard to arch your back when your glutes are squeezed. So go ahead and pull back, squeeze here, good. And again, he's got a really nice pull between his shoulder blades. His shoulder blades are not lifting, or he's not getting elevation in his shoulder. And again, if he is, I could say, hey, your shoulders are elevated, drop them here, giving a nice visual cue. But always take in this exercise, this pulling exercise, use it as a means of assessment. And through this assessment, I'm not necessarily doing it like an overhead squat assessment. It's just now the opportunity to cue somebody out of it. By no means is this an exhaustive list of what you might see when people do this exercise, and it's certainly not the right way to give a cue. The best cue that you can give someone's the one that works. So whatever cues you have in your toolbox, use that to help people. And if those cues aren't working, find something else. It's never the client's fault that they don't understand what you want with an exercise. We have to be the ones that are always challenging ourselves to help everybody learn how to do the exercise the way that they need to perform it.
So that is, you know, that's the, you can tell there's some serious friggin' similarities between one and the other, right? Like that's essentially the same assessment. It just sort of manifests itself whether someone is sort of, you know, pushing or whether they are pulling. So let's talk about what this actually means, right? Because we got a good picture of the posture up here. You know, again, the joint actions are the same when you see your client move the wrong way, like whatever, you know, for instance, in like the anterior pelvic tilt that we're seeing in the low back arch, it's the same exact list of muscles that we are going to see if we were to look on the overhead squat. If we had somebody squatting and their low back arched, because the muscles that cause an arch are, a short list of muscles. It's always the same list. It's just, oh, it didn't activate during a squat, but it does activate when you're pushing. That still means that we need to stretch these muscles out. We need to strengthen those other ones. So if we look at like NASM overhead solutions table here, and I think we have to look on the CES because they didn't put it in the PE. Did they? Yes, they did. Okay, never mind. So you'll notice there isn't like, we've got like a forward head and we've got shoulder elevation during the pushing and the pulling, but during the low back arch, it just says like overhead squat. Well, you could technically modify this list and put in parentheses here, pushing / pulling / overhead squat. And it means exactly the same thing. So when you see a client with an excessive low back arch while they are doing a push or while they're doing a pull or while they're squatting, right? It's tight hip flexors, right? Pulling down on the pelvis right here, literally causing that to arch. Tight erector spinae, pulling up on the pelvis, causing that to arch, or tight lat muscles that are also kind of pulling up on the pelvis and causing it to arch, very similar to the erector spinae, because they all kind of share some fascia there, right? Again, looking at our erector spinae as like this tight muscle, you can see it runs there, right? And so it's attached to that portion. That's why it is in charge of spinal extension, because it pulls, it's able to kind of pull along all that individual parts of our spine there. But then if you also look at the latissimus dorsi, you will see that also shares basically the same spot in terms of like fascia, right? This is just sort of underneath this big guy here, but that's that whole area right here. That's your thoracolumbar fascia. In fact, just so you guys can see a picture of that by itself. There's a really good drawing, actually. Yeah, tons of fascia in here, and fascia is that connective tissue. It's really, 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 really tight, and so like it often does kind of get pulled and causes overactivity and causes these movement compensations. So if my hip flexors are really tight and I need to stretch that out, I'm going to draw my hip into extension, right? I'm going to draw my leg back. I can even do this from a kneeling position. And then, that's really good in terms of like the hip flexors that are on the lower portion from my pelvis down. But remember, the other hip flexors that we've got are our psoas muscles that come from the hip up into our spine. So I'm going to straighten that out by also taking the same side arm up, squeezing my glute, and then lunging forward, right? And the reason I squeeze my glute is, well, if this is tight because of hip flexion, I'm contracting the muscles that are in charge of hip extension, which is my gluteus maximus, right? So that's sort of what we're looking for there. The tight hip flexors are pulling down the front. The erector spinae is pulling up in the back, and the latissimus dorsi is pulling up in the back as well. Underactive muscles, we just flip to the other side of the joint. Again, opposite of my hip flexors, that's my gluteus maximus. Now, are my hamstrings the opposite of my gluteus maximus? Sometimes, like a little bit, like the hamstrings assist with hip extension. They're a synergist. They're not necessarily directly opposite of the hip flexor complex, but they are like still helping with the gluteus. So like, those both are definitely going to be on our list. And then we're going to see this right here. Our intrinsic core stabilizers are underactive. Now, earlier I kind of said, I made this point where I was like, look, yeah, exercise is often about movement, but I would argue that it is just as much about anti-movement or, stabilization. I think that a lot of times, like exercising and just learning how to like, develop enough core strength to stabilize is also sort of the goal. I mean, we're going to look at, the freaking most impressive exercise in the world, in my opinion, which is the planche Friggin' planche is so difficult. But like it is all about like learning how to kind of stabilize and hold yourself out at a massive distance here, you know. So it starts with like this tuck. You can see like he's just doing all this like little bit of like wiggling and stuff. I was like trying to get there it is. So he goes up into this position kind of like that. He's doing, that's called a push-up plus, by the way. This right here, we're about to see, you know what? That's so funny. We're about to see this. This is strengthening your serratus anterior, these little like fish fillet muscles that are just below your pecs, but they're like below, they're like between your pecs and your lats and your abs. You know, they're the upper, like some people think they're the oblique muscles, but they're not. They're the upper ones like along the ribs there. He's doing, it's called a push-up plus, where he's doing a little bit of rounding with his shoulder blades and he drops back. So he's going to strengthen his serratus, and that's going to help him get better at this planche position. And then eventually he's going to get into like a full lean. You can see he's working on his wrist mobility, obviously, as well, the more he practices that. And then eventually he's going to end up, I'm going to skip forward in the video. He's working on his, you know, kind of, this is like motion, but you can see like he's really trying to stay as stiff as possible, right? Like his arm's not bending, it's just kind of moving gently. And he's just slowly working towards, where's the full freaking planche? Are you gonna show us like the actual freaking planche here? Internet? Ugh, that was frustrating. Wow, okay, well, there we go. There's a, yeah, so you can see like a full crazy elevation. Now, again, people are moving through full ranges of motion here. I want somebody to just stay freaking put. It is impressive that they can do planche push-ups, yes. But even just the regular old planche, really freaking hard movement here. And it's like the super extreme version of stability, right? So I would argue that like it's not always about crunching your spine or twisting your spine or extending your spine. Sometimes it's just about getting your spine to resist any movement. If I pull on it like this and it's like, nope, and it just stays put, right? It's really, really solid. The muscles that are going to do that are your intrinsic, meaning they're on the inner layer, core stabilizers. That's going to be your transverse abdominis, which are those abdominal muscles here on the front. Okay, your multifidus, which actually lives underneath your erector spinae. You can see this looks kind of similar to our erector spinae muscle, right? Except that technically this is an inner stability, and it's all the little tiny ones attached to the individual facets of your spinal discs there, right? And so like that is, sometimes you'll hear this called the multifidi, because technically these are each individual little muscles. But you know, if you call it your one big group, I don't know, call it your multifidus. And it's, you know, that's there for spinal stability. We've got our internal obliques, which are, you know, on the inside portion, right? So they are living right along the inside portion here, and eventually you get your transverse abdominis there in the front. And then you get your pelvic floor muscles, which are all these muscles at the bottom, kind of keeping your organs from falling outward. And then you get your diaphragm up top, and your diaphragm is actually there to help you breathe, right? That's the muscle that we contract down like this that causes our lungs to open up, but it does actually create a little bit of stability. This is why you kind of naturally go, you know, like when you're lifting something heavy, you're doing that because it activates your core musculature, and even your diaphragm creates a little bit of pressure. And so all of that is designed to kind of keep your discs in space, keep them in alignment, right? So again, I've got my transverse abdominis, that's kind of the front, the multifidus is in the back. I've got my internal obliques on both sides, pelvic floor muscle, and then my diaphragm. So all of that is designed to keep my spine in one spot and resist movement. It's about anti-movement, right? It's about stability, right? I'm holding something here, somebody's trying to pull my arm away, I'm like, nope, nope, and I just I resist it, right? Or someone's like here and they're trying to move me, I'm like, you know, like that's spinal stabilization. And then I would just, if I want to move my spine, throw another layer of abdominals right on front, right? Like I would just move and put another layer in front of that and attach it a little bit high. And that is becoming our six pack, right? That's our rectus abdominis, right? These muscles here. So now that's going to run from like, my sternum down to my pelvis, and that's actually going to crunch and move my spine like this, spinal flexion. Then I got my erector spinae living on top of my multifidus, and that erects my spine. I have my internal obliques creating stability on the inside. I got my external obliques creating spinal twisting on the outside, right? So yeah, the vanity muscles, the ones that, we all want to show off when we're at the beach, when it's summertime and we're trying to look nice and get a tan and, like show off our abdominals, that is the outermost layer. And that is really good for like moving your spine around. But when we look at like someone who's excessively arching their low back, the reason they're doing that is because they are having trouble resisting movement when those tight muscles pull, even though they're not supposed to be pulling. When they pull, the muscles that are supposed to be able to resist that don't. And so we see this spinal extension that we don't want. And that's sort of what we see there, right? So that is our sort of like low back arching overactive, underactive muscles, right? We're going to really try to activate the stabilizers, glutes, and hamstrings there. Any questions on those muscles? Questions, comments, concerns? Did we lose somebody? No. Okay. Right. So, whatever. Okay, let's take a look at the shoulders elevating problem, right? So let's say like, either in a pushing or in a pulling assessment, our clients like shoulders are elevating. Well, we just got to look at like what muscles cause scapular elevation, right? So the muscles that cause scapular elevation, the big one is going to be your upper trapezius, okay? So your upper trapezius is one of your, it's part of your trap complex, your traps. And it's the one that you tend to think of when you think of your traps. It's like when you see somebody with like, let's see here. What happens if I do huge traps? All these friggin' crazy, that's, you're very much seeing the upper trapezius there. And so there's a lot of different like layers to this. There's the upper, middle, and lower trapezius. But the upper trapezius is the one that elevates the shoulders, okay? So the upper fibers, when they contract, you can see they're going to pull along their lines, right? They're all attached to your scapula. Actually, this is a good picture here because you can kind of see the different layers. There's the shoulder blade living underneath all this, right? Like there's the bone there. And so the lower fibers are pulling this way. The middle fibers are pulling this way. The upper fibers are pulling this way. So the upper fibers elevate, the middle fibers retract, and the lower fibers depress. And so those are the individual sort of like directions that this is pulling. What do we observe? We observed this version. So we know that that's the tight muscle that's contracting when it's not supposed to. Basically, this person tried to use their middle trapezius to pull their shoulder blades back, but instead they use their upper trapezius, right? Because they're probably just much more used to using that. They probably have a stressful job or, are used to kind of carrying their bag and elevating, something is happening that's kind of creating that tightness. So the upper trapezius is definitely going to elevate the shoulders. Now, the next one, Mir, here it is. It's your favorite muscle.
Tell me.
The sternocleidomastoid. Always so fun to say. Because it just, I don't know, it just sounds like a dinosaur. Like,
yeah.
I love this muscle. I love and hate this muscle. So the reason it's called your sternocleidomastoid is because it is attached right here on your sternum and your clavicle. That's where we get the sternocleido part. And then it runs up to what's called your mastoid process, which is right here. You might know that as a pressure point, by the way. Any of you who have ever like goofed around with pressure points.
Yeah.
Like, you know, that is, you're poking your SCM, you're poking your sternocleidomastoid.
It's like in between the ear and the jaw. Right.
Exactly. And that's right where that muscle runs, right? So there it is. Look at that, sternocleidomastoid. That's a very weird way to write that, but I love this picture now. That's so weird, but I love it. So there it is, right? And that one, here's the thing. It doesn't necessarily actually cause shoulder elevation. This is a weird one because you're like, wait. The shoulder's elevating. That's my scapula coming upwards, right? Like if we look at like scapular elevation, right? There's nothing, you know, that shoulder blade, there's no attachment with this muscle here. So why the heck is that causing this elevation? Why is that related to our overactive list? Well, here's what's interesting about your scapula. And those of you who've been through our kinesiology class, you guys will remember this. Your scapula and your shoulder joint move as one sort of fluid connected, intertwined unit. You know, so like when we look at like our shoulder, what's called our shoulder girdle. Okay, your shoulder girdle is your clavicle, your collarbone, attached to your scapula, right? Now, this is not a separate bone. This is actually this little hook right here. That's part of your scapula. That's your acromion process is what it's called. And then your clavicle sort of runs across right here. So the sternocleidomastoid is attached right here, and its job is to raise the clavicle up. So when your clavicle comes upwards, what comes along with it? Your scapula. Okay, so it's not necessarily pulling directly on like the bladey part of the shoulder blade, but it's pulling on the thing that's attached to it. Remember how we talked about the overhead squat, and we said how, look, if your feet fall like this, your knees are going to rotate and cave in, right? Your ankle's going to affect your knee, which is going to affect your hip, which is going to affect your low back. The whole body is a chain, right? This is why we use the term kinetic chain. The weakest link in the chain is going to mess everything up. So when the clavicle elevates like this, it's going to mess up how the scapula moves. So that is why that is on our probable overactive muscles list. And then the easiest one is literally, it's in the name, the Levator Scapulae. And what does it do? It elevates your scapula. So this one is actually in the back. This one, it's attached to these little neck muscles here. So it actually does help a little bit with rotation and a little bit with this, but it's not great at that, but it can do it a little. But its big thing, you know, is when it pulls, you know, and drags the scapula upwards, right? So it's elevating the scapula. Now, there's a good picture from the back. And, you know, it is back here, by the way. If you reach your hand behind the back of your neck and you just kind of push right here, you'll feel like, you know, this tight series of muscles. You're like, oh my God, you know, like it's really, really tight. It really is quite kind of painful. Which means freaking massage it, work on it, you know. If it is that painful, it means you probably need to do a little bit of massage. So that's your levator scapula there. But let's take a look at it from the side. Let's get a little bit of a lateral view here. That's not bad, but I'd really love to see like a very lateral view. Come on, internet. There we go. That's what's up. Okay, so see how this is attached? Look at the angle that it draws. It's really kind of coming forward at an angle like this. So it doesn't just elevate the scapula, it also sort of dumps it forward, right? So now when you start to look at someone's posture, you know, it's really cold in here, but I'm gonna lose the sweatshirt so you guys can see a little bit better. 1 second. I refuse to strip on camera. My favorite joke in Zoom land. So, you know, you look at your scapula, right? Like it can move forwards and backwards, but it also like swings, right? It tilts like this. So when you see someone with like a really tight levator scapula. You see like the people who have like rounded shoulder problems. You know, this is something we're going to look at when we look at like arms falling forward on an overhead squat. You see this like rounded shoulder action. That's not just shoulder protraction. That is also like a dumping. The scapula is sort of swinging upwards like this, right? And so a part of that is like, if you tied a string to the top of my scapula and you pulled it up, yeah, it would just go straight up. But if you pulled it in the direction that this muscle's lined up, which is in an angle, it's going to dump your shoulder blade forward. So that is, you know, that is that tight muscle that we're seeing. That's why that's on the list. So these are three muscles that we really want to loosen up when we see our clients like elevate their shoulders. Now, how do we do that? Well, again, if your upper trapezius is in charge of scapular elevation, then what we need to do is scapular depression, right? And we can pull on this muscle a little bit more. The other thing that your upper trapezius does, guys, in addition to scapular elevation, it also does lateral spinal flexion. So it does this right here. So we can stretch our upper traps by basically trying to lay our head over to one side and then taking the arm up and over like this. And then you're going to drop this shoulder blade down. Now, one thing that's not really listed here that should be mentioned is another really tight muscle you're going to see are what are called your scalenes. These little itty bitty muscles, these little tiny ones that are also attached. They kind of move your ribs around. They assist with like breathing and stuff. They live underneath the traps. Well, I mean, they're kind of exposed in some spots, but they're very similar. They do the lateral flexion as well. But you can find that you'll get a little bit of a better scalene stretch when you really try to, like, you know, depress the arm. So when we're doing this stretch, we want to take it over like this, right? And then drop this arm down. And then I like to go palm forward because I just feel like I really get a much better stretch out of it. Because I'm doing external rotation that allows me to make sure that my shoulder blade stays in alignment. So I'm just going to sit here and I'm going to hold for 30 seconds until I need to. And I'm just really creating length in that upper trapezius. I do the same thing on the other side. And then for the sternocleidomastoid, right? So that muscle does a little bit of spinal rotation. And it's very much in charge of like this action here, right? Drawing the head forward. So how do I stretch that out? Well, basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to look over to one side and then I'm going to drop my head up like this. I'm going to keep, by the way, I'm going to keep my mouth closed because it also is attached to all those jaw muscles. So by closing my mouth is going to further stretch that out. And then because it's attached to my collarbone, one way that I like to stretch this more, I actually like to use my opposite hand and press my collarbone down. I like to depress my collarbone. So I will look to the side, look up, and push down on my collarbone, right? And again, I could get more out of this if I really want to like drop that opposite arm away. And I'm just going to get that really nice SCM stretch. And lastly, we've got the levator scapula, right? Levator scapula is in the back. Again, it is also in charge of rotation. So what am I going to do? I'm going to rotate my head. And then this one's also in charge of like this. So I'm going to stretch it by dropping my head down and taking my arm up, and that can give me a little bit of a pull. I take this arm out again. And I just tell my clients, I'm like, smell your pit. That's the best way to do it, right? You're just kind of reaching, putting your nose in your armpit, and you'll feel like a nice stretch right in the back of the neck there. So those are three ways to sort of like loosen up the things that are elevating our shoulders. Now we need to flip to the other side of the joint, right? Just like we did before. We need to like go from stretching into the other side, all the opposite stuff, where we get into the strengthening. So muscles that we need to strengthen are going to be the middle and lower trapezius fibers, right? So when we look at it, right, and we've got those three different fibers, where's the picture that was colored? There we go. That's the one I like. you can see like there's the top portion. This was overactive, and that was in charge of elevation. But the one that's in charge of retraction, right? That's the middle trapezius, and the one that's in charge of depression, right? Which, by the way, it doesn't do a ton, right? It doesn't really move much. Are the middle and lower trapezius fibers. Okay, so both of those are underactive. So we can get the middle trapezius fibers by doing anything where I'm doing like where I am retracting my shoulder blades, right? So a reverse fly would be a really good example of that. Rowing motions would be a really good example of that. I could even row, I could row in a neutral grip, right? That's not bad either, right? Anything where I'm rolling my shoulder blades back is going to be really good for my middle trapezius and a little bit of my lower trapezius as well. It's also pulling towards the center there. But if I want to get my lower trapezius going, I really need to make sure that I'm pulling my scapula down and back, which is why a lot of times we'll do what's called an A pull, okay? Or like, which is sort of like a reverse fly at an angle as if you were making the letter like an uppercase A, right? And so like one of our favorite movements to work on your middle and lower trapezius is what's called a YTA, or we call that combo number 1. Okay, so YTA combo number 1 looks like this. It's where you're going to hinge at the waist, okay, and get nice and comfy. And then I'm going to keep my thumbs up towards the ceiling the entire time. And I'm going to go into a Y. Now, that right there, this fly, very much does scapular retraction. So it is very good for my middle trapezius. Now, it is going to be tempting to raise the arms up overhead, but I'm working on resisting that movement and driving the shoulder blades down as I raise the arms up. Okay, so it's very important that you instruct your clients to keep their shoulder blades depressed. They'll want to elevate their shoulders on the Y portion. And so we're working on like training to resist that motion. That's why it's so good for us. It's sort of an isometric version of things rather than like a dynamic version of things. So I'm going to hinge at the waist, and I'm going to go into a Y, and then I'm going to go into a T, where I'm going to go straight back, right? So now I'm making the letter T, right? And then I'm going to go into an A pull. So Y, T, A. And I like to do what I did here. I wouldn't actually do thumbs up, by the way. I'm just doing this so you guys can see me. I love to do that with dumbbells and hands, and I love to go thumbs up towards the ceiling. Like, the reason why is because that's also going to be external shoulder rotation. So I'm rotating this way, which so many of our clients have problems with this. But if I get a client who really can't do that very well, I'll just go neutral grip, right? They'll go Y, T, and then just leave it in neutral and go A, but that's ball combo number 1. So showing you that here. Where the heck did it go? Oop. So Y, T, A. Now she's on the ball here, so we would say, that's ball combo number 1. But it does, if you're doing it standing, you would just call it, combo number 1. What's up, Chris? We lost you for a second.
Yeah, disconnected.
What's that? You had a name change too.
It just disconnected out of nowhere.
Oh, okay. So yeah, so those are the muscles that are going to help us retract our shoulder blade. Those are the sort of opposite. I would say the lower trapezius is the actual direct opposite of your upper trapezius, but your middle trapezius is sort of a synergist. Like it's the muscle that was supposed to be working, and similar to like how the glute was the exact opposite of the hip flexor, and the hamstring was a helper to the glute, so it was also kind of working against the hip flexor. Your middle trapezius is not directly opposite of your upper trapezius, but it was meant to do the job. This is like this little synergist was taking over for this, what was supposed to be an agonist. And then we're going to see other weak muscles are going to be the rhomboids. Rhomboids, which are those, this is the one that usually people are familiar with. The little muscles that live between your scapula and your spine there. And again, they work with your middle trapezius to do scapular retraction. So you can actually see there's the middle trapezius fibers living on top, and there's the rhomboids that would sort of be underneath that. And so again, it's just scapular retraction. So how do we fix this elevation problem? We're going to work a lot on, rolling those shoulder blades back. And lastly, we are going to see the rotator cuff as underactive. Now, the rotator cuff is a big group. There's actually a lot of muscles in here. You don't necessarily need to be super familiar with all of them. But they do have each of their own like individual names, right? So you've got what is called your Teres Minor. That's probably the main one that we really want to work on. Actually, I'll put that in a different, so the Teres Minor is this one right here, little tiny muscle that lives on the back of the scapula, and it grabs your humerus. So this one's not doing scapular retraction. None of your rotator cuff muscles are doing scapular retraction, but they do humeral external rotation. Okay, so you are going to see your different pieces here. It's going to be your Teres Minor, your subscapularis, which is this muscle. Actually, we're looking from the front of the shoulder here. Notice how this muscle is actually like on, like this is your collarbone, right? We're looking at the front of the body here. This lives on the inside between your ribs and your scapula. It lives on the inside. Normally, when we're looking at the scapula, we're always looking at the backside here, right? Flip to the other side. That's your subscapularis. Okay. Then you've got what's called your infraspinatus, which is this one that lives underneath the spine of the scapula. This ridge right here is called the spine of the scapula. So the infraspinatus is below that. I got to pull that up back here actually, because you're not going to be able to see that from the. Actually, there we go. There we go. Now we got a front and a back picture. Oh, zoomed in. So the infraspinatus is underneath it. It's underneath the spine, and it goes underneath the spine of the scapula, and so it goes here. Supraspinatus, you can see that one's above the spine of the scapula, right? It's here, lives on top. So both of those, right? Inferior and superior, right? Creating a little bit of stability in two different directions. Teres Minor again, and subscapularis. So those are really the big ones, right? But here's what you really need to know. You can just call it the rotator cuff, and its job is to rotate your shoulder, right? I know it looks like I'm moving my wrist, right? But I'm not. I'm rotating my shoulder. I'm moving from up here, right? So if I were to, like, let's say just bend my elbow and swing like this, right? That's my rotator cuff, or, that right there. So, and by the way, you guys want to see something funny? Check us out. Much as I can, look at the difference between my right arm and how far I can go back compared to my left. That is because of playing Frisbee. You got to cock it whenever you're doing like a flick. You have to cock it back this way. So my right rotator cuff's really loose, but my left one's not quite as strong.
You gotta get ambidextrous.
I know. I wish I was. I play with a guy who is. Ugh. It's so hard to guard him because he's just like, oh, just pass it to this one. And then you got to move your feet, and then you just move. Oh, of course. By the way, I know I've said it before, but I will mention it again. Anybody, all of my students, you guys are always welcome to come join my join the ultimate game. I've been playing with the same group of guys for like 10 years. It's super fun pickup for anybody who enjoys a little bit of ultimate disc. But yeah, so that is the rotator cuff muscles. Those are the muscles, we're gonna do a lot of external rotations, with a resistance band here, or even like a face pull, right? Everybody loves, The Athlean X guy, right? He loves freaking face pulls. I bet I cannot. If I just go face pull, gotta be the first video is this guy. Yeah, of course it is. Athlean X, you know. Everybody loves him, but this is a really
Let
good
me
movie.
show you how.
See, it's kind of getting everything we want it to, you know. We're really getting our client to do everything we want. It's a little bit of, all right, zoom out, guy. Okay, so he's doing this version here. It's not bad, right? Like when he does this version of a face pull, that's still pretty good. It's scapular retraction, right? But because his arms are going this way, that's internal shoulder rotation. We want a little bit of external shoulder rotation. So we want him to pull more. I think he's about to do it. Or maybe not. Yeah, I mean a little bit. You can see he's got his wrist kind of cocked a little bit, like but it should be, you know, we really do want to kind of get a little bit of like a pull this way, so we can get that external rotation in there as well. So that is sort of addressing the shoulders elevating. So now we've seen two of our problems, right? We've seen the shoulders elevating, and we've seen the low back arching. Now, what about that freaking head coming forward, right? What about if the pushing and pulling assessment, we see the quagmire from Family Guy, right? Well, again, we're actually seeing the same list of muscles here for the most part. It's a little bit of variation, but it's very close. We're going to see the levator scapula. They're saying sternocleidomastoid and upper trapezius here. You will sometimes see that listed. In fact, on NASM's other list on their CES, if you look at it, it's slightly different. They'll say it's the scalenes instead of the upper trapezius. Remember earlier I said those are basically the same thing. They're not really the same thing, but they're all attached in the same areas. They all run to the same areas. They're separate muscles, but like the difference is that your scalenes run to your rib. Your upper trap only runs to your scapula. But because they all kind of contract simultaneously, it all sort of works together. So our forward head posture, we're going to see the levator scapula again. So again, stretch that out, right? We're going to see the sternocleidomastoid again. Again, looking over, up, stretch that out. And then we're going to see the scalenes, which is just your upper trapezius stretch. It's the exact same thing. Just make sure you're depressing your ribs down. And that's how you get into the scalenes. So that list is essentially the same. Now it says, you know, a slight difference there, upper trap instead of scalenes. These are also not in the same order. I should switch that to make that easier to understand. Yeah. There we go. So the list is essentially the same, but just slightly different. Why does it think that this one's right and this one's wrong? It must have actually been spelled wrong. So that is yeah. So those are your overactive or your tight overactive muscles there. Now, underactive muscle here for the forward head posture is the deep cervical flexors. Now, this one sometimes, in my opinion, gets a little confusing. It's like, wait. If my head's coming forward, why would a muscle on the front, why would a muscle that's a flexor be underactive? And it's like, well, you got to remember like what a forward head posture is, right? So your deep cervical flexors, they're in charge of this. They're in charge of looking straight down. So like when I do this, that's my deep cervical flexors, not when I do this. Does that make sense? Like the sternocleidomastoid does that. The deep cervical flexors are the ones that do this. So we actually need to strengthen those in order to draw our head back and keep our freaking head on top of our body the way it's supposed to, right? Look at me from the side here versus like here, right? Got this forward head posture, but then if I tuck my, I roll my shoulders back and then I just tuck my chin slightly. Now my head is resting on top of my actual body. That's the posture we want, right? Now, I was doing kind of an extreme version. I'm like really tucking back here. You don't necessarily have to actually do that. Like, obviously, that's not what our posture looks like 24 hours a day when we're walking around and stuff. But you do want to sort of like, in the same way that like I don't walk around doing this all day, but I do it when I'm doing chest presses. I'm going to tuck my chin back while I'm exercising. So 3 movements that actually work really well for this are just straight up chin tucks. You can see here, he's just working on that. And then you can see here, you can also do like a little bit of a cobra stretch, and that gives you the opportunity to kind of tuck your chin. And then even if you're just in a quadruped position, like if he was doing a bird dog right now, right, if he raised his left leg and raised his right arm and did a bird dog, he could also work on that. Or planks. Planks are a really good one to kind of work on your extension. Flexion. And just tuck that chin. Give yourself the little double chin, guys. I know it's not flattering, but it is sort of good for our posture. So those are the muscles that we're going to address. We are going to write a program for that when we get to a bunch of upper body dysfunction. We're writing like a sort of upper body focused workout. But any questions on those overactive muscles today, guys?
No.
Feeling good? All makes sense? Ooh, what happened here?
So I got a question. So is it always like if it's one side overactive, it's always going to be underactive, or can it be like both sides? Both sides tight or both sides loose?
So we can say without a doubt, if it's an overactive muscle on one side, flip to the other side of the joint, yeah, you're gonna have an underactive muscle because it's pulling, right? However, there are some examples where sometimes it's a helper muscle that's taking over for a main muscle. You know what I mean? So for instance, like in me, right? Like my hamstrings are really tight because they're supposed to help with hip extension. They're supposed to help out my glute. My hamstrings like to take over for my glutes. So those are not opposites of each other. That's what we call that synergistic dominance. And it's where a helper muscle is inhibiting the primary muscle. I always say Robin took over and Batman can't do his job. That's what I always say.
Yeah.
So it's not always directly the opposite, but it's always a good place to start is just flip to the other side of the joint.
Cool.
Yeah. I would say like the Robin Batman thing works when we look at the trapezius, for instance. Upper traps are doing too much work. They're not the opposite of my, middle trapezius. But my middle trapezius can't do its job because the upper trapezius is pulling too hard. David, do you have a question?
No, I didn't have a question. I had the same thing to say. So pretty much when you have an overactive muscle, more than likely, like 90% of the time, you just want to flip over and boom, there's your problem. But sometimes in the case, it might be this or this, but that's where the knowledge comes in.
Yeah, and that's where, there's definitely exceptions to the rules, like there's like where it's like, man, like that is not how people normally move. But like, yeah, you are tight here and it's causing this weird habit because sometimes people's feeling is getting in the way. Like when you're sometimes like you hurt something, right? A lot of times like you'll pull a muscle. And so you're like, oh, I pulled my muscle. And so then you'll stretch that muscle because it feels like you're doing something. It feels like you're rehabilitating that muscle when it's like, hey, the reality of the situation is you over lengthened it. You need to shorten it back to length, And so you're spending all this time stretching and that's actually making the problem worse, and it's because like it feels like you're doing something like psychologically it's like, yeah, I'm making progress, and it's like, oh, you're really not. You're honestly kind of like, moving backwards.
So the question I have for you, has there been anything that you've seen where you just like where you saw you're like, how did that happen, like this one? But like, what would you say was the most uncommon thing you saw and how'd you deal with that?
Postural distortion. I've seen some weird stuff just with clients and stuff. So I'm trying to keep it to like something relevant to what we're talking about here. Yeah, I had a client who, they were an ex-personal trainer. So they were like, I used to be a trainer and now, I kind of fell out of it. I just want somebody else to tell me what to do now. And I'm like, that's great. Yeah, absolutely. I get that. I'd love to have I'd love to hire a trainer, guys. Somebody tell me what to do for a change. That sounds delightful. So Kendra was in a similar situation. And so and she had like these kind of interesting, little bits of posture. She would get like a really bad foot turnout and like I'd work on her calves and I was like, man, like your calves aren't super tight. Like, I'm not sure why your feet are turned out. And then like I was like, maybe it's like a knee stabilizing problem. Maybe it's the gracilis, the popliteus, sartorius. Those like stabilizer muscles. Maybe it's like they're not working. So like we did some stability. She had great balance. I was like, man, you got really good balance too. And then and it would only ever happen like when she was on a barbell squat. And it wouldn't happen when she was doing like body weight squats and stuff. And I was like, hey, if you were coaching a client through how to do a barbell squat, what would you say? And she was like, oh, hey. And she said a very similar thing to what I said, where I say like screw the heels in to create that external rotation. She would say like turn your feet out and drive through your heel. And I was like, okay, so like this is just like a pattern, like a dancer who danced for 20 years, gets used to doing something like a very specific way. She's just like used to telling people like majorly turn the feet out. When in reality, she didn't need that much turn. She got used to doing it that way and she found a way to do it and she got neurologically sort of programmed to do her squat that way. But I was like, hey, I know like, she's like, oh, I know how to squat. And I'm like, I know you do, but let's maybe try retooling like your stance width and your angle. Let's change this up a little bit and see how it goes. And that little adjustment locked her right into alignment. She felt way more comfortable, aches and pains went away. And so like that was kind of a good example of where it was like, man, it really wasn't just like tight muscles. It was just bad, sort of programming. If that all tracks and makes sense.
Okay. So sometimes it's not even the fact that like, oh, they're muscles. It's just something that is like in their head, right?
Yeah, well,
Sometimes.
that's why we call it neuromuscular, right?
Right.
It is the nervous system affecting the muscles. So
Okay.
yeah, it's still kind of the muscles, but yeah, I think you're right. And then sometimes it's all up here.
Yeah, I get that. Like when people start doing any type of sports, really, they're always really nervous, But I
Sure.
always say, you could tell when a person's used to doing something by how comfortable they are in that situation.
Yeah. It's funny. I've got a pair of prescription sunglasses, which I've never had before, coming, and I'm excited to play Ultimate with them. And I know that I'm going to get hit in the face at some point. like, I'm just not going to be used to seeing as well as I can while playing this freaking sport, and it's going to be a problem.
Are the
Yeah,
prescription glasses, are they like the Bill Cosby glasses? The dark one, the really black ones where you can't even see the pupils?
these are straight up sunglasses, but they just happen to have prescription lenses in them.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Crazy. Actually, I need to go to an optometrist. I've had that written down on my to-do list for like 4 weeks.
Dude, I went and they were like, you want to order some glasses? And I was like, no. And I just got my prescription.
Yeah.
And replace.
But glasses are expensive, huh?
Dude, I went to this website here. I buy direct, like EYE. And look at it, they got like freaking, it is so cheap. I got my frames for like $6.
Oh, what?
And then I got my sunglasses. Sunglasses were expensive because like they're specialty.
Yeah.
But it was $50. I dropped $53 total for 2 pairs of glasses.
Yeah.
What?
Wait.
Yeah.
What was that website called?
Yeah, right. I buy direct. EYE buy direct. You just have to know what your prescription is and you gotta like punch it in.
Yeah.
And you can try it. They have like a little face thing. If you're on your phone, you can like look at it and it puts like a little fake pair of glasses over you.
Oh yeah. Right.
See what they look like.
That's cool.
Yeah. Okay, so let's open this up here. So let's take a look at an example program for lumbopelvic hip dysfunction. So we're going to look at like 2 programs here. One of them is going to be very relevant. What is going on with my freaking Microsoft Word? Look at this. It keeps crashing. I'm going to try one more time, and then we're going to open up the PDF one. But I like the Word one because I can goof around with it. There we go. Breaking thing. All right. So we got 2 different programs here, right? We are going to see 2 postural distortions, both related to tight hips. But they are sort of manifesting themselves in 2 very different ways. So the first one we're going to look at is a client who has the low back arch. So we talked about like, you know, that sometimes happens during the pushing and the pulling assessment and sometimes happens during the overhead squat. The other thing that we sometimes see during the overhead squat is the excessive forward lean. So someone will squat and they'll do like this kind of squat where it's like their butt's sticking out and they're just dropping. It almost looks like a deadlift, you know, or almost like a good morning. And so that's the excessive forward lean. Now, here's the thing. Some of you will remember, you know, when we talked about the excessive forward lean, there's 2 causes to a forward lean. Sometimes it's tight calf muscles. And so like, sometimes you can see here, right? This person's leaning too far forward. It's because, actually, you know what? That's a much better one. It's because the ankle, look at how this is basically 90 degrees. Look at versus here, the shin's coming much further forward. And so if the calf is really tight and refuses to allow the shin to travel forward, then they have to stick their butt out in response. So what do? We have to figure out like, oh God, is this, you know, lumbopelvic dysfunction or is this ankle dysfunction? If we see a client with an excessive lean, well, what we'll do is we'll elevate their heels. And by putting their heels on plates, we take the stretch away from the calf, right? If we elevate this guy's heels here, this no longer has to stretch. So then all of a sudden, if their squat gets perfect after that little bit of elevation, we know that the real big issue here, actually, there it is. Yeah. Oh, that sucks. This is like low quality, but there you go, right? We put it on heel and then there he's able to keep his chest up. We know that the problem there is the ankles, right? But sometimes people lean forward for a totally different reason. Sometimes the reason they lean forward is because their hips are just straight up pulling them down. So their hips and their abs, right? Your abdominals, which crunch you forward, and your hip flexors, which raise your hips up, are basically just pulling you down into this like super low squat. So these programs are going to be very similar to one another, but with a couple key differences. So with the anterior pelvic tilt, the excessive low back arching, yeah, that's tight hip flexors. And yes, the excessive forward lean was also tight hip flexors, but they're different manifestations of a problem. So what we would do is we would work on foam rolling the hip flexors, and foam rolling the TFL, which the TFL is part of the hip flexors, right? Remember, that's the hip one right here. The TFL runs from here to here. It does do a little bit of this, but it also is in charge of the hip rotation, right? And then our main hip flexors is like the quadricep, the rectus femoris, right? And then the psoas, right? And then we see tight lats, right? Which sometimes cause that arch. So we're going to work on foam rolling the lats as well. And then we're going to foam roll, we're going to SMR the erector spinae. You'll notice I put a coaching tip in here and it says for the erector spinae, use a tennis ball and do not place it on the spine. So we don't foam roll our lumbar discs because they're very sensitive, but we can take a lacrosse ball and set it off to the side and get in there. So it's not that you can't self-myo. You'll hear sometimes people say, it's like, oh, I heard you should never self-myofascial release your low back. And it's like, no. You should never foam roll your low back. And foam rolling is an example of self-myofascial release, but there's other types of self-myofascial release. Any type of massage, right? I can use my massage gun. on my erector spinae, you know? So then I'm going to follow up all of those tight muscles with stretches. We're going to do a static hip flexor stretch. We're going to do a static TFL stretch. We're going to do a static ball lat stretch. We're going to stretch the arm out and get right under here. I'm going to do a static erector spinae stretch. So, you know, I'm basically going to lay down on the ground and twist like this, right? And that's going to stretch out my low back. And then I'm going to do 5 minutes on a treadmill, get nice and warmed up. Now I got to flip to the other side of the joint and strengthen the weak stuff, right? So now I'm going to do a floor bridge, which is that that hip thrust that we're kind of familiar with by this point, right? That is really good for the glutes. This is directly hip extension, right? This is the most hip extension movement. The glute bridge is literally targeting the moneymaker. That's all it does. It's a glute exercise, a little bit of hamstrings, but like major glute action. And then we're going to get a prone iso abs, right? We're going to get a plank in there. Plank's going to be really good because that's working on the opposite side. You know, we're strengthening the core here instead of letting the low back arch, right? But I'm going to pay very close attention. Make sure I'll bet when I do this plank, my client will try to arch their low back. By the way, if that exercise gets too easy, I could also have them raise one leg, or and now they're getting a little bit of like glute work while they're getting their ab work. And I'm super stoked about that. And then for our balance exercise, we're gonna do a single leg lift and chop. So single leg lift and chop is where we're gonna start with the ball. You're standing on one leg, you start with the ball on the opposite there, and then it reaches across like that. So you can see he's balancing on one leg here. And he just reaches across to the contralateral side. It was a really good one for balance. That's just teaching his core how to be nice and active and strengthening his glutes while he's at it. And then we're just going to do a lateral squat jump to stabilization. Again, that is a really good sort of glute exercise, right? So you can see here, she's just going to jump laterally, and she's going to hold that position. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and over between 3 to 5 seconds. But she is doing the stabilization. That is helping strengthen the glutes, but also working on the stability and hopefully keeping the arch, the back from arching while she's doing that. So what did we with the low back arch? We loosened the hip flexors, we loosened the low back, we tightened the core, and we tightened the glutes. Now, really similar to that, but slightly different, we've got the excessive forward lean, where instead of, you know, the hip flexors working with the low back, right? Like the hip flexors pulled down and the low back pulled up. With the excessive lean, the hip flexors pulled down and the abs also pulled down. So these two muscles are actually working together to go here. And my low back, which should be pulling the other way, is not active. So now we need to do the type of exercises that are going to pull us back upright. So we are still going to do a hip flexor stretch and a TFL stretch. Stretches. I say we're going to SMR the hip flexors. We're going to SMR the TFL. Then we're going to follow up with a hip flexor stretch. We're going to follow it up with a TFL stretch. But you'll notice I've got a static Cobra stretch here. And that is going to be for the abdominals, right? So now we're stretching out the abs. We didn't foam roll our abs because, you know, like that's that's a lot. You know, we can't really like put our foam roller on our abdominals. There's soft organs below that. You don't want to rupture your spleen, you know. But there we go, right? Just a little Cobra stretch, and that's going to stretch out the abdominals. And then we're going to do a static supine twist, which is going to be a really good one to stretch out. Not that one, that one. So this one here is actually going to be a really good stretch, not so much for the erector spinae, but for the oblique muscles, because the obliques may also be pulling us down. They're working with the abdominals. So we've stretched out all, you know, we stretched out here to allow us to get back upright. We stretched out here so that we can get back to neutral here. And now our client should be able to squat while keeping their chest up rather than dumping it forward because the abs and the hips are crunching too hard. So how do we strengthen the opposite stuff? How do we move in the other direction? Well, we're going to go with an Isoprone Cobra. This is literally working on spinal extension, right? So a little bit of spinal extension. He's keeping his feet down. So very weird. This is like a stop motion picture. We'll go with the video here. So she's contracting her arms, and then she's just drawing her chest just barely up off the ground. Now I could also do a Superman. Superman exercise would also be really good. That's the one with the arms forward where you also bring up the legs simultaneously. That's a swimmer. There we go. There's the, so up and back down. Here's one thing I hate, by the way. She's lifting her head. Don't do that. You have no reason to lift your head during a Superman exercise. Just keep your chin tucked so you can work on those erector spinae muscle or deep cervical flexor muscles. I hate it when I see people lift their head during a Superman. But that's, yeah, there we go. This is a much better demo. So there you go, right? That's also spinal extension. So both those would be really, really good. Side iso abs, that's the side plank. That's just Nassim's name for it. So there we go, little side plank action. And then for our balance, we get the single leg, opposite arm, opposite leg raise. This is a very much harder than it looks exercise. It's basically a standing bird dog. So you go like this, and you reach out with your left arm and your right leg. And it's sort of like a standing version of the bird dog, you know? And that's working a little bit on the extension, but like he's stabilizing here and learning how to like balance through like a full range of motion. And then we went the box jump to stabilization because that's going to be really good for the glutes. And again, we're trying to strengthen our glutes in general because they're the opposite of our hip flexors. So that is sort of the lumbopelvic dysfunction that we're going to see. We're going to look at arms falling forward tomorrow when we look at a program. I'm pretty sure we are. That would be, if I designed this, which I did, that'd be the order I would go in. And then we're going to look at like the shoulders, you know, all the elevation problems that we talked about. So we got a client who can't get their arms in line. They're dropping forward like that because they're so tight. And that's honestly about it today, guys. How's everybody feeling?
Good, thank you.
Yeah. How are my two new guys? Chris, how you feeling?
Good. Pretty good.
Love it. Love it. Joseph?
I'm good. Just need to like, I think for me, like I can see, I just need to be like, get into the practicing of it, which is where I learn it.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, honestly, like it is hard when you're not like, you know, especially if you're a physical learner. But trust me, like when we get back together, it'll be just like last time. Like we're going to kind of move through it all and feel some examples and be like, oh, that does pinch a little differently, you know? What about you, Edwin? How you feeling?
I think froze at the end there. I didn't catch something. Maybe you're
what's
just
that?
asking. No, I'm saying I think my Zoom froze. But yeah, good stuff today. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of stuff that I'm kind of going through as well, like tight shoulders and all that, all those muscles around there.
Right. Yeah. All right, guys. Well, it is day 9, so no homework today. We'll get our final piece of homework for this course tomorrow, and that'll about do it. I'll let you guys all out of here and see you tomorrow.
All right.
Cool. See you guys tomorrow.
All right, see you guys.
See you tomorrow. Yeah. Later.
Later.